Finally, we're going to answer that ultimate of questions. Who's been eating all of my lettuces and who's left all those mace marks in the walls? I'm John and this is Hannah.
Hi.
And we're going to be talking about the flail snail. Okay, so as per our Twitter poll, today we're going to be talking about the flail snail. Apologies, this episode's a little bit late, but even with promises of lettuce and adventurers to smash, it's kind of hard to get the little fellas moving. So, first of all, we're going to have a look at the origins of the flail snail as it appeared in the first edition Fiend Folio, which was one of the sort of flagship products from TSR UK back in the day. So, love, what does the flail snail look like in the Fiend Folio?
So, it's a very rare monster. It has 4 to 6 hit dice.
Okay.
It's 8 feet tall at the top of its shell.
Mm-hmm.
And it has 1 tentacle for each hit dice that it has. And you effectively treat those as like individual creatures while it's fighting.
So is it like, like with the heads of a hydra or whatever?
Yeah,
you have
that
to
kind
deal
of
with
an
them
idea.
separately?
You have to kill all of the heads.
Okay.
And each head is one of those hit dice.
Yeah.
Each strikes for 1d8 damage.
That's pretty hefty.
It
Especially
really
if you're
is.
low level.
Immune to fire, normal or magical, and poison. Hypersensitive to bright light, and thus is always encountered at night or underground.
I suppose that makes sense, because your normal snails, although they're obviously about during the day, it tends to be like the early morning, when it's just sort of getting light and it's still a bit damp and whatever, that you come across them.
Highly coloured shell acts as a robe of scintillating colours, which when it's attacked by magic causes the spells to malfunction. 40% chance of it malfunctioning, 30% of it functioning normally, 20% of it failing to work at all, 10% reflected back onto the person that cast it. If spell malfunctions, its effects will alter totally down to the discretion of the referee. Referee, not Dungeon Master.
Well, it's back in the early days of D&D where everything was a bit more flexible, and certainly I know that you tend to find in these earlier products there's more of an emphasis on just make some up, deal with it how you want, whereas certainly in later second ed AD&D and first ed AD&D, things started to get codified a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Shell weighs 250 pounds, retains magical properties for 1 to 6 months after its occupant's death, and can be sold for as much as 5,000 gold pieces. And that's all there is to say on it, pretty much.
Okay, so I've been having a hunt around, and it seems that the flail snail's first appearance in 2nd ed AD&D was in Monstrous Compendium 5, A Greyhawk Adventures Monstrous Compendium. And if you're not familiar with the Monstrous Compendium, these were the little tiny books you used to get that were little add-ons to give you some extra monsters. Loads of them got organised into the later sort of monster manuals and stuff like that. But the flail snail is a subset of snail in here, because they like to group similar things together, which is absolutely fine. It describes them as silicon-based gastropods, distantly related to ordinary garden snails. I'm guessing it's very distantly related. Their shells are average 8 feet high at the crown, and are masses of neon blues, reds, so very, very similar, so bright coloured. They've got the tentacles where the normal head of a snail would be, each ending in a 10-pound mass of hardened flesh covered with knobs. So there's your sort of flails as far as they go. As previous, a hit by a single tentacle causes 1d8 points of damage and could smash a 1-inch thick piece of wood, which is oddly specific, but there you go. A 4-tentacled snail makes 4 attacks, a 3-tentacled snail makes 3 attacks, so on and so forth. And that obviously relates to the hit dice, as it did in the Fiend Folio. And you treat each tentacle as a separate creature again. When a tentacle is reduced to 0 points, it's useless. Flail snails attack until all of their tentacles are dead. Once this happens, the monster withdraws into its shell and dies 1d3 turns later. The body has hit points equal to the combined total of all the tentacles, but is nearly impossible to attack because it's all inside the shell, obviously. Okay, so Flailsnails are still protected against magic by their colourful shell. It doesn't specifically give the name of the magic item that it's riffing off here, as it did in the Fiend's Folio, but we've got a similar thing, a chance of malfunction, a chance of it functioning normally, a chance of it failing or rebounding on the person who cast a spell at it. We also get here, I don't know if it mentioned that in the Fiend's Folio, that they're immune to fire and poison.
Yep. And
again, it mentions that they shun bright light. Now, as is often the way when they're sort of giving these one-page sort of spreads in AD&D, we get a bit more expansive sort of habitat, society and ecology sort of section. We're told that they live peaceful lives, crawling up and down dungeons and cavern corridors. Normally quiet, they aggressively defend themselves, chasing attackers until they withdraw from the sensory range of the Flailsnail, which is like 20 feet. Apparently, they live off lichen and algae growing on dungeon floors. Glands in their mouths secrete a substance that loosens the plants, and they then scrape them up and eat them. Females give birth to 1d3 young. They remain with the mother for 2 years, and their flails reach a weight of 5 pounds. Flailsnails mature at age 4 and live up to 20 years. They're described as peaceful beasts, but as we've said earlier, they're quite aggressive when it comes to defending themselves from perceived threats. One thing which we mentioned in other monster episodes, which I quite like here, is obviously it said in the Fiend's Folio that the shell retains a certain level of magic for a period of time after they die. Here we get a little bit more specifics about that. It tells us that a skilled armourer can fashion 1 to 2 plus 2 shields from a single shell. The shields affect spells, as did the original shells, rebounding them, etc., until the magic fades, which takes 1d6 months. After the magic fades, it's still a plus 2 shield, but it counts as being non-magical. In addition, bizarrely, freshly ground snail shell is needed to create the robe of scintillating colours. So it's nice that they've sort of gone back to what they referenced in the Fiend Folio and given a bit of a reason for it. One robe can be made from a single shell, and the shells will sell for a princely 5,000 gold pieces on the open market. Although, what the open market is for, like, enchanted snail shells, I don't know. Wizard market, I suppose.
One thing in that bit that stood out to me, because I've gone and watched a couple of videos about actual snails, is that it says that there are females of them, implying that there are also males of them.
Yeah, we'll check out.
Snails are entirely hermaphroditic.
Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna hazard a guess. I mean, I don't know about this, so don't like.
I'm guessing the people at Wizards didn't know that.
Well, it wasn't Wizards then; it was TSR, wasn't it? But don't shoot me, internet people. But I'm guessing they probably didn't do like that heavy research when they were like doing the Flailsnail. I'm pretty sure it probably just started off as like a random, I mean, I don't know this for sure, I'm just guessing, but you can imagine the people who worked on the original Fiend Folio, they're like, we've got X number of pages to fill with monsters, and they get to a point where they're like, oh, we're struggling a bit, we've done all these really like creative monsters, like the wells running a bit dry. When you get to the point where you're like, oh yeah, how about a snail that's got like flails built into its like head? You can imagine that they didn't really go great into the sort of like the research for it, and I think once it was established, previous sort of editions have just sort of been riffing on that. Now, I did attempt to see if I could locate it in 3rd edition or 4th edition, but unfortunately I couldn't, certainly not amongst my collection of books. But if anyone out there knows different and wants to holler at us about the Flailsnail in either 3rd edition or 4th edition, you can leave us a voicemail, drop us an email, that'll be absolutely cracking.
So what's it like in 5th ed then?
Okay, well, bizarrely enough, the Flailsnail is in one of the 5th ed books, Volo's Guide to Monsters. So it seems odd that such a wacky creature should be like straight sort of back in the cut and thrust of it, because they've not published a load of books for 5th edition. Their publishing schedule for like Wizards is like a lot slower. They're sort of drip feeding it a little, so it seems odd that they've sort of gone for one of these bizarre monsters. But we get a slight sort of tweaking of it in 5th edition, since it's described as a creature of elemental earth, and there was no hint of a connection to the elemental plane of Earth previously. It was just some freaky-ass gastropod with flails on its head. But as we've said, there seems to be a move sort of later on in D&D to have everything linked to a deity or some other weird plane of existence or something like that. So it's an elemental plane of Earth creature. It has a multi-hued shell again, although it's not really, the hues aren't described as much as they were previously. It seems to be non-hostile. However, if it perceives a threat, it unleashes a flash of scintillating light and then attacks with mace-like tentacles. So in this, the shell has effectively become a weapon through which they can project a beam of light towards people, sort of dazzling them. It doesn't really do any harm, but it can give them a disadvantage because they're dazzled. Then obviously the snail wades in with its flails and just lays about them. We've got a little bit here called Trail of Treasure, where it says, left undisturbed, a flail snail moves slowly along the ground, consuming everything on the surface, rocks, sand, soil, whatever, stopping to relish crystal growths and other large mineral deposits. It leaves behind a shimmering trail that quickly solidifies into a thin layer of a nearly transparent substance inedible to the snail. This glassy residue can be harvested and cut to form window panes of varying clearness. It can also be heated and spun into glass objects of other sort. Now, you can imagine that'll actually be pretty valuable in your typical sort of medieval world, because obviously reliable technology for making glass didn't turn up until sort of fairly late on, hence why you only get small windows, even for very rich people. And yeah, okay, D&D is not an exact representation of a medieval world. Obviously you've got magic, you've got wizards, and you've got stuff like that, and technology that never really existed in the medieval times. But I think it's quite interesting that it potentially has quite a valuable sort of product.
It also explains how all those fantasy taverns can keep affording to replace the windows when you keep throwing dwarves through them.
It does raise an interesting point as well. I mean, let's say you find an abandoned dungeon with a flail snail or two wandering around in it. If you're just profit-minded, you're probably better to just let them do their thing. Let them keep wandering around the dungeon eating the moss and whatever. They're not doing anyone any harm. Stay clear of them, and every couple of months you go in, scrape up this glass, take it to your glass blower you've hooked up with or whatever, and be oh, here you go, here's some glass. And you could make a tidy profit like that if you wanted to. We get a little box out as well about using the snail shell. It's described as weighing about £250. It still sells for 5,000 gold pieces. So obviously inflation's not taken a hold of that yet in the D&D world. Many hunters seek the shell for its anti-magic properties. A skilled armourer can make 3 shields now from one shell instead of the 2 it used to be. So maybe inflation has got a hold of it. For 1 month, each shield gives its wearer the snail's anti-magic shell trait. When the shield's magic dies, it leaves behind an exotic shield that is the perfect item from which to make a spell guard shield. The shell can also be used to make the robe of scintillating colours. The shell's ground and added to dye while the garment's being fashioned. So pretty similar to the second ed version of it.
Although they only last 1 month instead of up to 6.
Yeah. So if we look at the actual stats of the flail snail, in this it has the anti-magic shell, which gives it advantage on saving throws against spells. Any creature making a spell attack against it has disadvantage. In addition, if the snail succeeds in its save, you get to roll a d6. 1 to 2, the spell fails or has no effect. If the spell targets only the snail, it has no effect on the snail and is reflected back at the caster. 3 to 4 is no additional effect. 5 to 6, the shell converts some of the energy into a burst of destructive force and sends out this wave of sort of energy that could harm anyone nearby to the snail. So they've obviously adapted the way the shell works. It's a little bit different, but it's still got that random thing. It's still bouncing off magic left, right and centre. So thematically it's similar, even though the actual mechanics have altered a bit, and they've trimmed it down from being percentage chances to just a d6 roll. Well, we get a description of the flail tentacles, although in this we don't get the different hit dice versions. We're just told that the flail snail's got 5 flail tentacles, that's it. Whenever the snail takes 10 damage or more on a single turn, one of the tentacles dies. If even one tentacle remains, it regrows all dead ones within 1d4 days. So that's a bit of a departure from the previous one, because previously if you chopped off all the flails, it just withdrew into the shell, and it died after like d3 days or whatever it was. Whereas in this, it's just going to withdraw into its shell, eventually regrow them, and it's good as new pretty much. Although it does say here, if all its tentacles die, this snail retracts into its shell, getting total cover, and begins wailing, a sound that can be heard for 600 feet, stopping only when it dies 5d6 minutes later. So you can still kill it by lopping off all the tentacles, but if even one's left, it'll regenerate.
The wailing thing, that was something that was mentioned in both of the others, although I don't know whether we actually read it out on either of them. Although I notice on this one, it doesn't say that it's likely to draw in a wandering monster.
No, it just...
Whereas on the first ed it definitely did, and I think it did on the second.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to me, and again, I might be wrong, it's just my impression, so don't be hating on me for this, internet, but I do feel, having like read the 5th edition books, that like maybe like the sort of the random wandering monsters maybe like fallen out of favour a bit. Mm-hmm. So in here, you know, it just sort of, it tells you that this noise can be heard for like up to 600 feet. So if you're using wandering monsters, then obviously, yeah, if a monster's within 600 feet, it's going to hear that there's something going on. Whereas in the previous sort of editions, it sort of explicitly told you like, oh, this is going to affect the chance of wandering monster encounters and stuff like that. And then we've already talked about the scintillating shell and the sort of like the beam it can send out. Obviously, it gets multi-attack. It can attack with all of its different flail tentacles. In this, instead of doing d8, they do 1d6 plus 3. So a slightly different dice mechanic, but you know, similar sorts of damage. It's bludgeoning damage. And then when it withdraws into its shell, it gains a +4 bonus to AC until it emerges. And it can emerge as a bonus action, so it can sort of just like pop out of its shell and start laying about somebody. So that's the Flailsnail in 5th edition. So shall we talk about some ways in which you could potentially use it in your game?
Well, first up, you've smashed the window at the Fantasy Tavern.
Yeah. And
you're going to get barred if you don't replace it. However, the barman happens to know that there's a Flailsnail in an abandoned old dungeon.
Yeah. We spoke a bit about it earlier. Like, so you can make yourself a tidy profit, like getting the glass. And I quite like, that's probably my favourite bit about the sort of 5th edition version, is that sort of like little addition to it. And I think I don't really tend to run 5th edition. I run like older sort of versions of D&D. I think if I was going to use a Flailsnail in a game, I probably would port that in from 5th edition, which normally I don't really find a great deal in 5th edition monsters that I think adds a lot to it. Normally they're sort of tied into like the elemental planes like this is, or demons or gods, and that doesn't bother me. But I really do like the sort of glass bit here.
Yeah, when we were first looking at it, I noticed that this is one of the few times where the 5th ed's actually got more detail than the first ed.
Yeah.
On like things you can do with this creature once it's dead. But the second ed, it's more again, but it's kind of different more, where they've chosen to focus.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, again, like what we were saying earlier, where it seemed like the Flailsnail was like a bit of a sort of joke monster, like a bit of a filler monster in the Fiend Folio. I think when they're sort of like, they're bringing it back in 5th edition, they've obviously had to think like, oh, we know it's a joke monster. It's always going to be a bit of a joke monster, but how can we make it like a bit more of an interesting thing to bring into a game? Which I think they've tried to do by expanding on it, which is great.
Something else that occurred to me when we first started looking at this is that there's almost a class of D&D monsters that seem to be there for the kids who like to play with bugs.
Oh, yeah.
To get a creepy crawly from their garden and drop it onto a table of miniatures and watch everybody else at the table freak out. And the Flailsnail sort of strikes me as like the one creature that I'd be quite happy to do that with myself, because I quite like snails and it wouldn't upset the snail too much, and it'd probably be quite cool to have it there like doing its
slowly
thing,
sort of moving about. Yeah.
And because it'd be so slow as a real snail, it'd be almost real time to a D&D combat.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting idea. I mean, to be honest, I've kept sort of like water snails and whatever as pets when I was younger, and like you say, I don't think it'd really bother a snail if you put it on the table. And
a bit of beer and drop it back in the garden after.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, to be honest, it's probably, like you said, roughly about the right scale, give or take a little bit. And like I said, they move so ridiculously slowly anyway that you could just be like, oh yeah, okay, wherever it moves, that's where it is, where it's on its turn. So, like I say, I think it'd sort of work quite well. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good idea. One of the other things I liked about it is in the Fiend Folio and a couple of the other bits like the Monstrous Compendia, it specifically says it's a silicon-based life form. Now, I found it a little bit weird at first that they specifically mention that, because obviously we know that like actual snails aren't silicon-based life forms because they're real, and it seems odd that they just sort of throw that in as like a throwaway little thing and it's never mentioned again. Now, obviously, they've expanded on that when they say, oh, it's from the elemental plane of Earth. That's probably why it's a silicon-based creature. But it made me think that like it's just like an incongruous little detail that they've thrown in there. And it made me think of the old Horta out of
I was going to say,
Star
it's probably
Trek.
Just a reference to the Horta.
Yeah, well, it made me think about that, because that's one of the most like famous sort of like sci-fi examples of like a silicon-based life form that I know of. And again, it's like a slow-moving creature that is potentially monstrous and very dangerous, but at the end of the day, they find out it's just trying to protect its young. It's not actually murderous intent. So, which, like you say, fits very well with the Flailsnail, because it's not overtly aggressive unless it perceives it's being threatened, and then it just lashes out. And once you withdraw out of like the range of its senses, it just sort of goes, all right, that's that dealt with, and it carries on doing what it's doing.
That would be the big difference if you're looking at them as two potential creatures. Obviously, the Horta, she's very, very intelligent.
Yes, yeah.
Whereas these are just your standard rampaging mob and or garden snail.
Yeah, according to 5th edition, the poor old Flailsnail's got intelligence 3, so we're not going to see any sort of genius like Horta level like Flailsnails. However,
I don't think it's going to be mind melding with Spock anytime soon.
However, I think it'd be potentially interesting. I mean, obviously these stats in there, they can be altered as you need to fit your game. Like you could increase the intelligence of the Flailsnail without altering any of the other stats. You can still say it has pretty much the same behavioural patterns. And I think it'd be really interesting to do like a fantasy version of like the episode with like the Horta in. You know, like the
work well.
Yeah, the mine guy calls you in and he's like, oh, there's this like terrible creature that's like blinded all my men and it's attacking all my men. So like you turn up, you start investigating, and then you find out that the miners came across like these like snail eggs or whatever and like destroyed them or like took them away, and that's why the Flailsnail's like going mental. And then if you discover that, again, it's one of these lovely sort of like moral dilemmas where it's like, I mean, obviously if you've got murder hobos, they're just going to romp in, kill the monster and be like, give me that XP. But if you've got like a slightly more nuanced, that's fine. If you love that, that's grand. Crack on. But if you've got slightly more like nuanced players, when they find that out, they're going to be like, well, what do we do now? Do we just go and wipe it out when like, all it is like a mother in inverted commas, like protecting its young, and like, who's the real bad guys? Because yeah, it's probably killed some people, but if the sort of mine guys hadn't like stolen its eggs, that wouldn't have happened. So you know, where do you sort of draw the lines and where are your boundaries in terms of things like that? So I think that could be really interesting, and it'd potentially be a way of like using the Flailsnail for more than just like, oh, you're in a dungeon, you see there's loads of glass everywhere. Oh no, here comes the Flailsnail. And sort of like just having it as like a wacky sort of comedic monster in a game.
See, similarly, I could see it being quite a useful Underdark wandering monster.
Yeah.
If you're doing that sort of a campaign, because it's not particularly intelligent. It's not gonna be like a massive tangent on your adventure to go and deal with this particular like threat.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to deal with this particular threat,
you can just leave it alone.
Yeah, you can just leave it alone because it's just a big ass snail wandering about eating rocks.
Yeah. One other thing I did want to mention, which isn't directly related to the flail snail, is there's the sort of, I suppose, I don't know whether you'd call it a subgenre of games, but there was this idea that I know a famous OSR writer, Jeff Rience, talks about on his blog. I don't know whether he invented it, so again, apologies internet if he invented it or if he didn't invent it, but there was this, they called this idea the sort of Flailsnails conventions, and being in that sort of vein of, it's got to be an acronym, they say, it's free location and inclusion laws supporting new and interesting leisure situations, Flailsnails. And the idea is it was a series of like articles or rules that people could follow, and it meant that to run their games, and it meant that you could take your character from one game, drop it into another game.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And they basically had like a series of like charts, which if you were like a really powerful character into like a lower level game, you'd roll on some of these charts and you'd get like a few like flaws and little sort of like challenges that make it a bit more difficult for you. Or if you were like low powered in a high powered game, the reverse would be the case. You'd get a couple of rolls on these tables to like boost you up a bit. And the idea was, once your PC died in any game, you couldn't use it in any other Flailsnails game. But I don't know how long it actually ran for. I know there was a Discord community for it at one point, and I quite like the idea of sort of people just being able to take the character and use it in a game, especially since we know that like AD&D was designed to be like more sort of like tournament friendly. And I think it's a great thing that you could just like take one character, port it into another game. I think that's a really cool thing. And I think at the time when they did it, I mean, open games and stuff like that are more common now. I think sort of at the time they did it, I was trying to find the date of this post. So we're talking 2011-ish, around about that time. I don't think these sort of like open games where you could bring in other characters were quite so common. So I think that was a really cool thing to do. And like I say, I know it's only tangentially related, but they did call it Flailsnails, so I'm going to like slip it in while the big guy's munching lettuce in the garden.
Interesting.
Okay, so that's been our episode about the Flailsnail. We hope you've enjoyed it and you've got something out of it. If you want to get in touch with us, maybe you've got some ideas for future episodes, or maybe you want to comment on this or any others we've done, you can leave us a voicemail message using SpeakPipe. There's a link in the description of this show. Or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and keep gaming.
Bye.